Dr. Lippincott is a Marine Corps veteran, Claremont Publius Fellow, commentator, and researcher. He is a newly minted PhD from Hillsdale College, where he has now successfully defended his dissertation, and his writings can be found on Substack, X, and the website American Greatness.
Shall we expect some transatlantic military giant to step the ocean and crush us at a blow? Never. All the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined, with all the treasure of the earth, our own excepted, in their military chest, with a Bonaparte for a commander, could not by force take a drink from the Ohio or make a track on the Blue Ridge in a trial of 1,000 years. This is my favorite piece of geopolitical analysis in the American tradition. I think it's right. It's from Abraham Lincoln, from prior to the Civil War. And what Lincoln articulates there is what I hold is the decisive fact of American geopolitics in our history, which is our almost complete invulnerability from foreign invasion. We have this marvelous geographic position, the world's biggest economy, and we have a spirited and well-armed population. And since 1812, we have not been invaded, and I would argue have not really been meaningfully threatened from abroad in the sense of being conquered. And today, I think the prospect is just laughable. You know, we are armed with nuclear weapons, a huge military, armed forces. I mean, this is compared to any other competitor nation. We have vast resources for our own defense. What this draws out, though, is that the heart, then, of American geopolitical thinking is not simply national defense, not now. The title of this panel is The Geopolitics of Liberty, and I would argue our geopolitical situation has already set us up for the defense of liberty. So what then explains American involvement abroad? We have this vast military presence. We have bases everywhere all over the earth. If it's not national defense, what is it? And this is the heart of what I want to argue today, that it is the view of justice that frames how we think about geopolitical reality. And the view of justice in our own regime today has been developed from the progressive era onward, so about 125 years. And it's fundamentally concerned with global uplift, the idea of missionary crusading in the name of our values, so freedom, democracy, equality, etc. And this, and I would call it the new view of American foreign policy from the progressive era onward, was a break from the original American understanding both of justice and of geopolitics. And this topic is obviously relevant right now. America is at war, at least maybe not legally, but under the Constitution, but we are at war. Our troops are in combat right now. And so understanding the moral framework that shapes our use of force abroad is of the utmost importance today. I think war and killing really focus the mind. Right? It draws out political reality. You can see the law in the form of the mailed fist. Barack Obama had this quote that government is what we do together. And he's talking about, we have social welfare programs and parks and schools. And I would point to, if you really want to understand what a state is for, look at the weapon systems it deploys, look at the violence it enacts. When and why will it kill human beings? That draws out the political question, the question of justice, really, really clearly. Coercion and violence. And in the early American Republic, you can see this especially in the Declaration of Independence, which begins as a foreign policy document. It's establishing the United States as its own country. It is addressed to a candid world, right? The audience is ultimately not just the British government, but the world and the American people. And the view of justice framed within the Declaration of Independence, its framing of foreign policy, its framing of geopolitics, is one that acknowledges the nations of the earth as occupying a separate and equal station. And so the Declaration and the founders themselves, this natural rights view that Dr. Ellis was just talking about, that view had a European origins, and it had a foreign policy context, basically from the 17th century onward, from the end of the 30 Years' War. And that system, rooted in public natural law, established that the nations of the earth are not only distinct, but they're equal. And that means that they all have a unilateral right to determine their own way of life, and that means ultimately they're the judge in their own case. And so you can see the problem when you don't have a legislator for the world. So how do you mitigate disputes? Because every person, when you can judge in your own case, obviously, God is on my side. Well, no, God's on my side. Well, then you're slugging it out. And that problem of violence and how to bracket that violence was the animating principle of the world order into which the founders stepped. And so for them, the Westphalian system brackets war. It frames war, but you set up these rules. So what we know is international law doesn't have a legislator in the sense that we think of it, as a force above us. Rather, it's between these sovereigns. They establish a relationship of mutual acknowledgement of each other's sovereignty and equality. And they do that for the sake of bracketing and limiting violence. And this, in a way, humanizes war. So much of the way we think about violence and war is, you have a military, they're in uniform, they have a chain of command, they have a flag, they fight for a state, it has a treasury. When the war is over, then you have a peace treaty. This system had declarations of war. All of those are the features of that Westphalian system. And the international law that the founders had wasn't designed in the way we think of it now as kind of like humanitarian, or it's a sort of moral restraining. It was, but the goal is fundamentally self-interested. You want to limit the destructive power of war. The natural law, the first and highest goal is the preservation of happiness. And when you have when you're dead, you can't be happy, right? At least not in this world. And that sort of hard-headed reality is like, well, how do we limit this? And you can't have a world government. There's all these reasons why human beings didn't have a regime that they can share. And those realities are with us now. But the founder's solution, again, is sovereignty, meaning separate station and equality. And it has these limitations on war designed to serve the self-interested desire for defense. And that makes possible then civilization, scientific development, economic trade, by acknowledging that war is a reality and finding ways to limit its destructive effects. And so that view was dominant in the early American republic. So when you look at George Washington's farewell address, for instance, he talks about the not enslaving ourselves to our passions and staying out of foreign countries as a matter of self-interest. And there's a lot of famous lines from the farewell address, but I'll see if I can pull up one of my favorite, which is on the value of neutrality and liberty. And so Washington says, if we remain one people under an efficient government, the period is not far off when we may defy material injury from external annoyance. When we may take such an attitude as will cause the neutrality we may at any time resolve upon to be scrupulously respected. When belligerent nations, under the impossibility of making acquisitions upon us, will not lightly hazard the giving us provocation. When we may choose peace or war as our interest, guided by justice, shall counsel. So for Washington, neutrality, independence, sovereignty, and tied to it a respect of other nations' sovereignty, is in America's interest. It makes us powerful and strong. We store up resources that we can use to defend ourselves. And it's a part of, it's within this framing of international law in which these ideas make sense. There are separate and sovereign nations. And throughout the 19th century, this was the decisive fact of the way the founders and their descendants thought about justice and therefore about geopolitics. So, my expertise or the subject I've been studying is the Pacific Theater in World War II and the lead up to that conflict. Well, in the 19th century, when the United States sent Commodore Perry on the expedition to open up Japan, Perry scrupulously respected the rights of nations in the way that he addressed the Japanese. And so the complaints were about the violation of American rights. But they were insistent on not, forcing the Japanese to adopt the American way of life. That wasn't the goal of that mission. And I think one of the best articulations of this thinking comes from Millard Fillmore, who is often forgotten, but he has just a great statement of this consensus view. And he says, nations, like individuals in a state of nature, are equal and independent, possessing certain rights and owing certain duties to each other, arising from their necessary and unavoidable relations, which rights and duties there is no common human authority to protect and enforce. Still, they are rights and duties binding in morals, in conscience, and in honor, although there is no tribunal to which an injured party can appeal but the disinterested judgment of mankind and ultimately the arbitrament of the sword. So that early, again, these are just examples of how the founders' thinking, captured in the Declaration of Independence, their thinking about justice, frames our foreign policy. And the break occurs in 1899 and 1900 with the Spanish-American War and the Open Door Note in China. And those events are related. So the United States, for the first time in the Spanish-American War, takes colonies. When it does so, the colony we take is primarily the Philippines. And this draws us into East Asia in a way that we hadn't before. And the justification that President McKinley gave for the war was not rooted fundamentally in American self-defense, but rather in ending the cruel barbarities of the Spanish towards the Cubans. So there you see a turn to a moralizing, missionary, crusading foreign policy. No longer is the concern neutrality and defense. Now the concern is ensuring the uplift of mankind, global management in the name of raising up civilization. And that view remains dominant in American foreign policy up to the present day. You can see this at the beginning of World War I. Woodrow Wilson talks about making the world must be made safe for democracy. So the problem with the Germans is not that they're going to sail up into Washington, D.C. and burn the Capitol down. It's that there's these immoral, aggressive powers in the world. They're tyrannical, and we need to liberate the German people from their own government and build a world order that can lift up mankind. So if the founders' foreign policy is about neutrality, sovereignty, equality between nations, the progressive view is hierarchical. There are the righteous, and then there are the wicked. And the righteous have knowledge. They know what justice is, and they can impose it on others, and that means you cannot have sovereignty any longer in that older sense in this new system. And I think the decisive, again, the crucial moment to capture this idea in international law is the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928. And if any of you teach AP US history or have some awareness, this is often mocked because the goal of that treaty was to outlaw war. That's the way it's typically framed. It's trying to outlaw war. It's kind of ridiculous, right? But the real aim of the treaty was, and I can quote it here, it says that the high contracting parties solemnly declare in the names of their respective peoples that they condemn recourse to war for the solution of international controversies and renounce it as an instrument of national policy in their relations with one another. You may notice that isn't just an outline of war. It's outline war in a specific sense, as an instrument of national policy in their relations with one another. What that treaty does is argue or establish or attempt to establish that nations should not have a unilateral right to wage war. And that key component of sovereignty, the ability to use violence and make judgments about it without recourse to anyone else, had been a core part of sovereignty. Now it's removed. And that, this Kellogg-Briand Pact becomes the foundation for the Nuremberg trials after World War II, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. And I think it frames, again, our thinking about aggression as a moral concept in international law today. So, where does that bring us? The geopolitics of liberty, as a theme for the panel. And I would argue that we need to go to the heart of the question of justice. It is absolutely imperative that we raise the question, what is the goal to be served and why? Why is it good? Why is it just? Because the facts of the world are just there. And you could take two separate views of justice and you present, two individuals, different views of justice. If you give them the same set of facts, they're going to walk away with very different ways of thinking and understanding those sets of facts. And so right now, you're looking at the Iran war. I want to tie this into what's happening right now. The question of a nuclear-armed Iran. Is that a threat to the world and to us? Well, you know, the question of in itself, what does it tell us? Well, there is an Islamic Republic that's armed with nuclear weapons. It's Pakistan, right? So again, this raises a question. Okay, why is Pakistan fine but not Iran, right? Well, Iran and the United States have a long history of tension and anger. Well, I'd point out that America had a really nasty relationship with Vietnam. 50,000 Americans killed, massive abuse and torture of POWs, brutal fighting for a decade, right? And today, we're happy trade partners. They make us t-shirts, we go over there, they fly the communist flag next to the American one. This is great. We're happy friends now. And so again, it doesn't, you know, how we think about history, these facts, and again, there's so many to go through, again, is framed by our thinking about justice and our own good. And again, I want to draw our attention to those questions, highlight the central importance of thinking about justice in a serious way in terms of framing geopolitics. And again, that break, there was an older American tradition rooted in natural rights and the natural law doctrine in the founding. There's a progressive break. It's tied into their view of history, morality, and the desire, an explicit rejection of the older natural rights framework in favor of a missionary and crusading foreign policy. And I would argue that their view of foreign policy also very much is reflected in our domestic politics, in the administrative state, in the way that we think about justice here, in the welfare state, etc. So again, those are the core elements I want to draw out here in this talk. I look forward to your questions, and I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you.
Join us in falling in love with America again.